Hello, welcome back. This is Religious Studies 361, Ethics, and the topic for today's class is the just war tradition, specifically the draft. We're going to study the draft. Now you may be surprised we're dealing with the draft because in the US the draft is a non-issue pretty much. Okay? The draft was abolished here in 1973, and I'll let you know exactly how it happened. However, you need to know that the draft is still a major issue in many other countries of the world. In fact, in Europe, there is still a draft in most countries, and until the early 90s, 1991, all countries in continental Europe had a draft as a system of military recruitment. All countries in continental Europe, I said. So the exception is Britain. Okay, Britain has a tradition of all volunteer forces. All other countries in Europe use the draft. In 1991, Holland was the first one to abolish the draft and move on to an all volunteer system. Now, when I say volunteer in this context of military recruitment, it doesn't mean volunteer as when you volunteer for the Red Cross or something like that. Okay? It means simply that you are not forced, that you enlist for a salary, that they pay you a salary. You sign an agreement, a contract. That's what volunteer means in this context. Okay? So Holland was the first one to abolish the draft and move on to an all-volunteer system in 1991. Belgium, 1 year later. Then in 1996, France and Spain did so. And then a couple of years later, Italy and a couple of countries in Eastern Europe have done that so ever since that time. Okay? However, there is a draft, a military draft in Germany. There is a military draft in the Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Norway, Finland. There's a draft in Russia. There's a draft still in most countries of Europe. Okay? And that causes social tensions, and we will see how those tensions are resolved. Okay? And we will more specifically look at the case of Germany towards the end of the lecture. There are other countries that have mixed systems. That's the case of Mexico, for example. Mexico has essentially an all-volunteer force, a professional army, as it's called, like in the US, but Mexico combines that with the idea of training their citizens in the military. And so young men need to go for military training. They need to go for military training, say once every, I don't know exactly how it is, maybe a weekend every month for 1 year or something like that. Okay, but they don't really make up the actual military force. The military force is made up of for volunteers, professionals. Okay? So this issue is still a very burning issue in other countries, although in the US it's no longer a current problem. Right? The US has a tradition of volunteer forces. So it goes pretty much with the British tradition, the same as Canada and other English-speaking countries. However, the draft was used in the Civil War temporarily. It was used again during World War I for just a few years until the war ended. And then it was again activated in World War II. But this time it did not expire. It was not phased out. It continued after World War II, with the exception of 1 year, 1947, when Congress forgot to renew the draft. So for that 1 year, there was a comeback to the all-volunteer system. So the draft continued as a system of military recruitment until 1973. 1973. In 1969, President Nixon created a committee actually, I would say. It's known as the Gates Commission. Anyway. It was presided by Robert Gates, and it was made up of the best experts in pretty much every relevant field to the military, economics, military strategy, but also in history, sociology, psychology. And they were to study and make recommendations as to whether the draft should be kept or should be replaced with an all-volunteer system. By 1970, they finished their studies. They came up with huge volumes of very technical studies, and they recommended that the draft be abolished and that the system moves back to an all-volunteer system. But they also recommended that a registration system be kept in place, which is what you have now, the registration for the draft. That recommendation was not implemented until much later, until the late 70s, 1978 and 1979, under President Carter. So for about 5 years or 6 years, there was no draft and no registration in the US. Now, in this class, we're going to look at the conclusions and the studies of the Gates Commission. Why the Gates Commission came to the conclusion that the draft had to be abolished. It's kind of technical, but it can be simplified. I'm going to simplify it for you. And so hopefully you will understand by the end of the class what the main issues are. First, let me start with a very simple question. Say we have two armies. Let's call it Army A and Army B. And let's say each of these two armies have the same number of men, say 100,000 men. Okay? But in Army A, we have draftees, and we pay them $100 a month each. And in Army B, we have all volunteers, and we pay them $1,000 a month each. Now, I need to clarify something. One of the important characteristics of the draft, the main characteristic of the draft, is that draftees do not get a market salary. Draftees do not get a market salary. Draftees get only a symbolic, a token salary. So a draftee in 1973 might have been getting $40 a month or $30 a month. And that's because it was the US. In other countries, maybe $10 a month, something totally symbolic. Even today, a draftee, even in rich countries like Germany, may still get $80 a month, plus, of course, food and clothing and transportation. But the salary itself is symbolic. Okay? Symbolic. By the way, when I say the draft, other synonymous expressions are conscription, compulsory military service, obligatory military service. All of these expressions mean the same. The draft equals conscription equals obligatory military service equals compulsory military service. Same thing, okay? So back to my question here. Here we have these two armies, Army A and Army B. Army A is made up of draftees, and Army B is made up of volunteers who get a salary, $1,000 a month. If I were to ask you which of these two armies is cheaper, what would be your first reaction? Army A, because you pay them $100 a month versus $1,000. Okay. Well, hopefully by the end of the class, you will understand why Army A is much more expensive than Army B. This is what the Gates Commission really worked at in clarifying these concepts. Okay? So, to the Gates Commission, conscription, the draft, military service, obligatory military service is a tax. A tax. Now, what is a tax? A tax is a value, an economic value, normally in the form of money, but not necessarily. But normally we all pay our taxes in the form of money that you give the state in exchange for which you do not receive an equivalent value, correct? The way we make transactions is, say I want to buy this book from this guy, and so he says, okay, this book is worth $30. So we've come to the agreement that this value, an object, is the equivalent or has as much value as my $30. And we trade the one thing for the other. Okay? That's how the economy works. That is how the economy works. The economy is not about money, really. It's about values, economic values. If you were in a desert island out there